Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I'm actually recording this Saturday morning, which I never do for a Monday episode. And I am stoked. It's a great week for me, and partly because I did a couple great interviews I'm really excited to bring to you guys. So I did a 1 hour, 45-minute deep dive with Gloria and Terry Crawford, founders of Initial View, who launched the product Glimpse, which is spreading so rapidly. And so I can't wait to bring that interview to you guys, and that will run right after the Jay Rosner interview. So Jay Rosner's got part 4, which is this Thursday, and then we'll have the Gloria and Terry Crawford interview that I think you guys are going to find really helpful. And then I also did an interview with Jin Chow. Now, Jin is the founder of Polygens, and Polygens is the nation's leader at taking high school students who have a passion for a project, but they really have no idea where to go to cultivate it. So let's say you've got a student and they're fascinated by like Gothic architecture on college campuses. So what they'll do is they'll pair that student up with either an industry expert or a PhD student who specializes in that area. And they'll work on going deep in that area of the student's interest. So it's a tremendous learning opportunity. It can be a great thing to do over the summer. I just really appreciated Jen, and I thought that she answered my questions really well. It was a tough interview. I asked her some very challenging questions, and I could not have been more happy with her answers to the questions. I know what some of you are thinking. Stuck, I thought you didn't like passion projects. Sometimes I hear that in the counseling room. It's not that I don't like passion projects. I don't like passion projects when a family comes to me and the student doesn't have any passion, and the parent or the student expect me to come up with some type of project for a student that doesn't have passion. You know, that's what I'm against. I'm also against people thinking that their passion project parts the Red Sea and all of a sudden they're going to designer you because they did a passion project. I'm against that, but I'm all for students pursuing what they love with gusto. I even have a name for that. I call it their compelling narrative. So just want to set the record straight on that one. And so that interview with Polygens will actually run right after the interview you're hearing now with David Hawkins. That's a 4-parter. And so you're going to hear part 2 today, part 3 next Monday, part 4 the following Monday. And then after that, you'll hear my interview with the founder of Polygens, Jin Chow. So anytime I have great interviews, I think you guys are going to like a lot. It really gets me fired up. So I've got one update, and then we're going to get right into today's episode because this episode's already going to be well over an hour, which is long for us for a Monday episode. So my one announcement is that for our college counselor confab, the interest form has been sent out to our webmaster, and it will be up on yourcollegeboundkid.com by Thursday's episode. So if you're interested, please complete the form. Now, if you've already previously been on our old version of College Counselors Confab, you're going to be grandfathered into the new group if you're interested. We still want you to complete the form, but you'll be grandfathered in. So you don't need to see yourself as applying. But if you have not been a part of our group, we do encourage you to apply, and we'll review your request and get back to you. The application basically is just a Google form that'll be on the website. Now, if you're wondering, what is College Counselors Confab? Well, it's a group of college counselors who support each other. We discuss any issue that can make us a better counselor. For example, we may discuss the growth of kids going overseas, or we may discuss how the FAFSA fiasco is impacting families. We may discuss how one college has drastically increased the cost of housing, or students are having difficulty finding housing. Or we may discuss schools that say they're test optional, but we have reason to believe that they may not really be test optional. Or maybe we'll have one local counselor who will really share some local intel of a college in their backyard. So we meet for an hour a month. Now, the time is to be determined. In the past, we met Sunday night, but we'll see if that's still going to be best time for this group to meet. That'll be on the form once you fill out. And we are asking for a commitment to attend at least 7 of the 12 meetings. We know people are busy, so we're not asking to commit to 12 out of 12 or even 11 out of 12. Of course, we would, love to see if you can make it every time, but if you can commit to the majority of the meetings and we think you're bringing something that our group would benefit from, then we will, in fact, invite you. So it's co-led by Michelle Silbernagle and me. Michelle's a counselor out of Washington State who I've gotten to know and I have a lot of respect for. She's a big supporter of our podcast. It's also a group that brings together 5 different types of counselors. So I'm in a bunch of these groups. Most counselors are. And a lot of them are just for one type of counselor, like IECs, for example, independent educational consultants. And that's definitely going to be a part of the group. There's more IEC counselors out there probably than any other type in the country. So that'll be one group. But we'll also have independent school-based counselors, public school-based counselors, CBO, which is community-based organization counselors, and counselors stationed overseas, or ones that send a lot of U.S. kids overseas, like a Kevin Newton. So it's all very different roles. I've done all of those roles except for the international one. But it's kind of a bringing together of a really diverse group of counselors, not only when it comes to the type of counselors they are, but also all types of diversity as well, like geographic and gender and specialties that different people have. And so we can all sort of, racially, ethnically, all different types of diversity. So we can learn from each other. And so that's, that's our group. And it was kind of birthed out of, I'll tell you the history, it was birthed out of this podcast. The very first time when I set up these webinars, like 4.5 years ago, with people like Gil Villanueva, who at the time was at Richmond, Sam Prouty from Middlebury. Well, when we had these sessions for our families to come interact with these thought leaders in the world of college admissions, 50% of the people that showed up were college counselors. And I realized, okay, we kind of have a special community here. I didn't realize we had so many college counselors listening to the podcast. And then our 2022 survey confirmed that. 1 out of 10 listeners is a college counselor. So that's kind of where the history of the group formed. And we're excited to come back with a 2.0, as they say, the improved version. All right, friends, I'm very excited about today's episode. I think this is an episode that will accomplish what our goal is. Our regular listeners know our mission is to make college knowledge available to all. And on every episode, I say to myself, can we provide content that someone who's in year 45 in the counseling profession will say, I learned something new? But also, will a brand new parent, a neophyte, let's say there's an international family new to America, a mom, can she follow our conversation? Or are we talking so much inside baseball that it goes over her head? This is extremely important to me. You say, well, why is it so important? Well, the reason why it's so important because the most important thing we have in life is not our money, it's our time. I take it very serious to not waste your time. I feel very honored that each and every one of you give us the precious gift of your time. And you guys know I'm a chatterbox. So we're talking about a nice chunk of your time, and your time is your life. It's an investment. So I get excited when I think we've landed the plane, as they say. pulled off both sides of that spectrum. Super experienced in your fourth or fifth decade, and you can say, you know what? This podcast is great professional development that makes me be a better college counselor. Brand new parent, maybe you barely speak English, listen and learn, and you follow our discussion. So for today's episode, Susan and I have a discussion of NACAC. Now, Susan gives us a great history of NACAC, and she's been going to NACAC for 40 years. I know it may be confusing. So NACAC is both a conference and it's a professional organization. So Susan shares her big takeaways from the NACAC conference in LA. I've been doing that with you. I wanted to get Susan's big takeaways. We were there together the last week of September. And then, we just sort of have a free-flowing conversation about a couple issues in college admissions. And then, of course, we'll have part 2 of 4, David Hawkins, talking about NACAC's study on the state of college admissions, looking at what does the research show are the biggest factors that admission officers use to determine who they admit. And so we'll be doing that today, and then we'll be transitioning in what does the survey show that high schools think are important in this process, and then we'll be looking at the difference between what's the perception and the reality, but that'll be next, in week 3, part 3 and part 4. All right, let's dive in. My conversation with Susan about NACAC. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Great, great, great. Friends, I'm really excited because you may remember I've mentioned this even on several podcasts that I wanted to tap into Susan's experience at NACAC because we were there together. And of course, we did our reception. But I don't know, what were there, Susan? 6,500, 7,000? It was a huge number.
Yeah, I think around that.
Yeah.
Big jump from, the huge decline during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then now it's rebuilt to almost twice the size of, 10 years ago.
And we saw each other a couple times at the conference because I remember when you were there.
It's hard to cross paths when you're in that big a crowd, but it was wonderful spending time with you.
The convention center was huge. But I hadn't had a chance to really talk to you post-conference and ask you what were your takeaways. And I know we were just chit-chatting before we came on today, and you brought up something that I think our listeners would be really interested in. So why don't you share what we were discussing earlier? Because I think it's important.
Well, and I know I run the risk of kind of being the old fogey here in terms of providing a longitudinal perspective on some of this. I started going to NACAC when I was more or less a rookie admissions counselor, in the 1980s. And back then it was kind of a bit elitist, not as much as College Board, to be frank. Sure. It was a membership organization.
It used to be really anti-IEC back then.
Oh, for a long time. Yeah. For a long time. And it was very kind of two-party. It was the high school people and the admissions people. And it was a real professional association, meaning it had a governance structure, and it basically wrote the ethics for the profession, and created recruiting opportunities, fairly high-level recruiting opportunities. There certainly was not as much of an emphasis on access as there is now. Now, access to higher ed is one of the driving factors in the association, both on the high school and college side. But there were no community-based organizations or college access organizations at that time. There were basically no independent educational consultants. If there were people who owned their own business, they were doing private school day and boarding placement. They were not doing college placement. That kind of crept in under the dark of night as time passed. But the big thing for me from the beginning is that we had a professional association that established a high bar for professional behavior and how we were going to keep students at the center of the college admissions process and protect them from kind of below the belt recruiting tactics that in the end really just served the institutions and not the kids. And that was very meaningful to me as a young professional. I felt very noble, about that. And luckily I worked for a college that was very high-minded and extremely student-centered at that time. So, when I take the leap from there to now, a pretty big leap with the pandemic figuring in there prominently, due to federal intervention by the Justice Department, the National Association for College Admission Counseling basically has had to lay down its professional guidelines and any enforcement practices.
Susan, why don't you unpack that? We talked about that in 2019 when it happened, but not everybody either remembers or heard those 2019 episodes.
Was it that long ago?
Yeah.
I guess it was right before the pandemic.
Yeah, it was fall of 2019.
You're right.
Mm-hmm.
So, some parents who are listening may occasionally hear or read the terms the wild, wild west of college admissions. And one of the reasons for that is the removal, basically the rug being pulled out from underneath the professional association. For quite a few years, I sat on the admissions practices committee of my regional ACAC. NACAC is a national organization, but it's made up of a whole bunch, probably about maybe 15 or 20 state and regional affiliate groups that build community and governance within. So I had been active in New England on the ACAC.
People hear me talk about SACAC quite a bit.
Right. The conference
every
that
year.
we go to.
Yeah.
And I was quite active here in the Pennsylvania ACAC when I moved here to the school where you and I shared our years together, Mark. But as an admissions practices member of that committee, I was essentially an enforcer. So, for example, there was a principle of practice in the official Statement of Principles of Good Practice, which guided the professional ethics nationally. There was an ethic written that colleges could not provide incentives for early decision applicants, that because they felt that would put pressure on students to make premature choices that were not necessarily in their best interest. And I remember I was charged in my state going after a highly reputed college and admissions dean who I knew personally, where they had come out with a bold statement that they had limited financial aid and it was going to go need-based financial aid. It was going to go first to the ED admits. And a complaint had been brought by someone on the secondary side. It came to me, and actually it went to the National Association, to the big committee, the super committee. And then they charged me with negotiating this with the college. Now, you might say, if you're listening to this, and this is all very strange, what were the repercussions? Well, if a college lost its membership in NACAC, it then could not participate in the national college fairs, the national portfolio days, the national conferences, the state and regional conferences, and basically they would lose an enormous recruiting venue and relationship
as well as being
building.
shamed in the profession with all your colleagues too.
And you know what? People cared more about that than the reputation. Being high-minded meant your institution was popular, high reputation, kids wanted to go there, that you didn't have to stoop to bribery and extortion to enroll kids in your first year class, right? And so that slippery slope was held. Now, the other area where there was often a contentious dialogue was around the May 1st candidate's reply date. And that was the hill that we were all going to die on, right? That no college, with the exception of kids who were committing early decision, no admitted students could be expected to pay a non-refundable admission deposit prior to May 1. And this was like the bedrock of everything. It was literally the bedrock on which a lot of other professional practices were built. And because everybody shared that, the only colleges that did not share that were proprietary schools for profit. And they, at that time, could not be members of NACAC anyway, so they didn't care. So there was a big dividing line between the not-for-profit, professional, and the proprietary institutions that were run as businesses. So it was all very clear. So the Justice Department started getting involved back in the 1980s. And there was the first enormous lawsuit that was based on price fixing among the most selective colleges in the country. And a lot of people forget that this happened first in the 80s because it's actually just happened again. Right. That's a topic maybe for another time, Mark. And I actually didn't hear any buzz about that at NACAC because
I didn't either.
It was just breaking.
I didn't realize that it was the 80s.
It was the 80s.
I knew about it, and because they really came down and kept the schools. The schools lost some of their. Well, I mean, it's arguable. It's still debatable how that played out and whether that was good or bad, if depending on who you talk to. Because I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but some people felt like, they were attempting to not just to really have people pick a school based on what they really thought was the right school, as opposed to who gave them the most money.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mark. And that the wonderful series that you just did with the financial aid director at Bucknell was an astounding, I was about to say expose, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It was just really a great unpacking of how need-based aid at the highest level is awarded. First of all, how need is determined and how it's awarded. And what happened after the 1980s, where colleges were found to have been, the feds called it colluding, although I disagreed with that. Basically, what it meant is that after all the admissions decisions were finalized in March of a given cycle, the financial aid directors would meet to compare the EFC calculations for the students they had already decided to admit. None of those admissions decisions could be changed. Right? But what the colleges wanted to do is exactly what you said, which is agree on a family contribution so that colleges could also benefit from the wisdom that other colleagues were applying if they were understanding a family's circumstances more fully. But the whole idea of institutional methodology, they wanted to bring onto kind of a level playing field, right? So once that was gone, once that determination was that will never happen again, and it really didn't. I mean, if it did, it was illegal at that point. But colleges, it was the COFHE consortium, COFHE, Consortium for Funding in Higher Ed was the name of the group that was told to stop doing that. The COFHE still exists, but I think it serves other purposes. But, when that ended, that is why colleges since, the early 90s have come up with vastly different family contribution figures, just as Erin explained. So families, if you haven't caught that series and you're up for a lot of detail, it was fabulous. It was an excellent series. I've never heard anything quite that detailed, and with a very conscientious lens. I really respected that.
Friends, if you missed that interview, just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and go to the interview tab, and you'll see Erin Wolf's interview on 18 reasons why college aid awards differ so much from one college to another. It's about an hour and 40 minutes.
But so that was, early 90s. That's when variable financial aid awards really exploded, coming from the most highly selective schools. So whatever has happened in the meantime, the feds have just this summer, I think, maybe in the spring, gone after another level of collusion on ability to pay and how financial aid information is maybe being misused. I'm not going to say any more on that because I don't have the details, but, so in 2017, Mark, as you pointed out, the Justice Department went after NACAC as an organization and looked at what had become of the Statement of Principles of Good Practice, now called the CPP. Am I going to remember what the CPP stands for?
It's amazing. I remember when I was working with you, statements of principles and practice. That was something that felt like it had a lot of teeth.
Oh, it did.
Yeah.
And we put it on our school profile.
Yeah.
That we, as a secondary school, adhered to the Statement of Principles of Good Practice. As a high school, I had very clear guidelines that I could bring to the administration at our school and say, I have to behave in certain ways because we are members of NACAC, which is the highest level of ethical behavior, and I will not trespass this. So for a high school, it gave me kind of the higher moral road to fall back on, just as it did in college admissions offices. And now the principles of practice are recommendations. They are no longer enforceable. The enforceable piece through the admissions practices enforcers, which I was one of.
You don't want Susan on the warpath after you. That's like a dog after a bone, by the way.
Oh, I was terrible at it, Mark. I mean, I would do it, but I actually got off that committee as fast as I could because I was not always comfortable. But what I felt I was doing was, especially for high schools and colleges that had strayed over the ethical line more out of ignorance than ill will, I was able to help those people. I was able to point that out and help them elevate their practices. And 9 times out of 10, they didn't realize what they were doing. And they very much wanted to maintain their membership in the professional association. That was great. But I saw the dark clouds on the horizon, and I knew the big guns were, going to start firing. And, I stayed on committees to try and preserve the Statement of Principles of Good Practice. But when the feds laid it down. So what do I see happening as a result? Well, as soon as the association went from a enforceable professional code of practice to recommendations, the colleges that were thrilled to be able to elevate their recruiting practices and incentivize everything, the tidal wave started. And we all guessed which colleges would be the first to start doing things that had previously been unacceptable. And you and I could name them, but we won't on the air. I, as a college counselor at the time, I felt very strongly about helping kids understand when they were being manipulated. But parents had to face the money issues in a way that they had never faced before. And I think that's where we are now, where because colleges are persuading families with incentives galore and, I don't know, it's buyer beware. There's a much higher level of buyer beware now. And I worry, and that's why I'm glad we're on the air, Mark, is we continue as a podcast to just educate and let families know what's going on. And my sense of the conference this year, though, is that no one's talking about this anymore. The level of care has receded. I think we're seeing a generation turnover in the profession.
Let me crystallize for people when we say this. So one of the things that Susan's talking about is how much the profession has become a business. One of the things Susan is talking about is it just really hit her in the face at this conference how much college admissions has become business, and it is not as student-centric as it once was.
Right.
And so that's really her lead up in her history is all geared toward making that point. And it's almost not even debated anymore. It's just accepted.
Yeah, and that's the difference. Is at first, Mark, as it was creeping.
Mm-hmm.
It was a creep. Marketing hit the college admission process in the 80s and 90s. There was no real marketing. I think the internet opened the door, of course, to oodles of that. And most of it is good. Most of it is, look at us on a podcast, college knowledge for,
Right.
for everybody.
Yeah.
And What has happened though now is there is a generation turning over in the profession, and the professionals who are coming up through the profession over the last, 10 years, even 15 years, are of a business mind. They are of a business mindset. And there's a big gap now between the people who choose to go into high school college counseling or independent college counseling, serving kids and families. Big gap with the college admissions folks. There used to be a lot of us who moved back and forth from side to side, depending on our life issues. And we all felt very connected and responsible to each other. And now I think, just like in most marketing and sales businesses, that there's a big gap between the consumers, the educators, and the sellers. Now, not all of this is bad.
Yeah, but I'll give you an example of what you're talking about. This is actually a listener to our podcast who used to do college admissions at one of the most selective schools in the country, one of the she brand names of the brand names. And I was having a conversation with this listener about how things have changed. And she was telling me, like, back in the day, you went into admissions to help people. Either you loved students or you loved your school.
Right.
She said, now there are literally people going to my old school with a plan. I'll do this to 1 to 2 years, and then I'll go flip to a place where I can make a lot of money, leveraging the fact that I did admissions at brand name U. It's almost like people are being intentional, even in seeking out admissions jobs, as an opportunity to springboard to make a lot of money with companies out there that are hiring. I remember somebody that I worked with at KIP years ago who went off to one of the brand names of the brand names, got a master's. And then I was talking with her, how many international admission organizations recruited you so with all kinds of incentives because they could go market to their families in mainland China and other places that you had worked. You hadn't even been in admissions, but you were a graduate of Designer U. So that's just one of the many ways where you see the business creep.
Well, and I think because so much of college admissions now is about data analytics, and a college I was aware of this a long time ago, but as computerization and software has advanced, so have the companies that are kind of part of the industry that circles around college admissions. We've talked about the algorithms that help colleges analyze their contact with students over, develop some historical patterns about the kinds of students who, if admitted, will enroll. So the industry itself is attracting a lot of young people with different skill sets. That's a good thing, but colleges, at the same time as they're becoming more reliant on data analytics, are eliminating a lot of the face time with students, the counseling elements of their job that attracted a lot of us into the profession. And it just, at the conference, Mark, it just wasn't talked about very much because I don't think it's at the forefront. I mean, one thing I laughed about is that the vendor, the exhibitor hall where all the vendors are, has become the centerpiece of the physical conference.
You know what? That's the place to go. Like, you go hang out in that main aisle. I hung out in that main aisle for an hour and a half, and I saw so many people I've interviewed on the podcast were there. And
it's very different.
The thought was, this is what I'm going to do in future years. This is like Grand Central Station. This is where you meet everybody.
Well, it's also where where NACAC puts the food. So, so if you don't want to buy crummy convention food, you go get freebies. But it what used to be viewed as tacky and kind of low now is not just acceptable; it's what we all look forward to. So,
the networking is such a big part of it, right? The networking is, but some things have stayed. Like the college fair is still.
Yeah.
There's this huge college fair at NACAC. This year they had 63 international schools
It's amazing.
participate. And the thing that's great about the college fair is a lot of times you're getting senior level people.
For once.
Yeah, senior level people behind the fair because they're at the conference and then they go over. And so I know for me in the future, I'm just blocking that whole time out to just walk the aisles. I blocked an hour out, but I'm just going to block the whole thing out because I saw anybody and I mean, so many people that I've interviewed on this podcast, they were there behind their tables, and it's really great to just touch base in a short period of time with so many people.
And it's just for us. It's the college fair is just for the counselors. So it's the one time where we get as counselors who provide direct services to students, where we get to go around and touch base with colleges that we want to connect with. A long time ago, what we used to do, Mark, when I was on the other side of the table, is counselors would walk around with transcripts and try and get reads on kids. And I mean, I remember that so well because I doubt anybody does that anymore because first of all,
when did that stop? I haven't seen that.
Well,
how long ago was that?
Probably around the time that you went to KIP.
Yeah.
But, it was a way to get a read. And now colleges won't do that anymore because the deal now is no one can look at a transcript. A college admissions person cannot look at a transcript, even if it has scores on it, even if it has some extracurriculars on it, and say anything about that student's admissibility, unless you work for a college that has a very high acceptance rate, that is basically can look at a GPA and what the student is taking course-wise and say, yeah, sure, they meet our standards and blah, blah. And no selective college can do that anymore because the whole process is so much more complicated, and kids are no longer viewed as, thumbs up or thumbs down. It's what bucket do they fill? What niche do they fill?
Did you have any session you went to that stood out to you?
Well, I went to a couple on the future of test optional admissions because I'm very committed to that. Very, very committed.
What do you think about the conversations they were having or the content there at those sessions?
Well, I think the colleges where the jury is, there's a whole bunch of colleges that have no credible research that went back very quickly because they wanted to and because their competitors started going back, but no credible research. And I'm sorry, I've read it, I've heard it, Mark. I understand the statistical research better than a lot of people. And there is nothing that I have heard that supports reinstating standardized testing. Another time for that conversation. You know how I feel about it. But if it's for marketing purposes, sure, colleges can do whatever they want. And if they want to scare away a lot of applicants who are from under-resourced families and under-resourced schools and who aren't paying for test prep, maybe whose parents didn't go to college, if they want to scare away those applicants who might have, terrific grades, fine. They should just be honest about it, right? So that was where I was kind of falling. The other schools, that had been test optional before the pandemic obviously feel great about that. And they have lots of research to support that the changes in their student body are exactly what everybody, including the faculty, was hoping in terms of equity and access and achievement and, whatever. But some colleges continue to talk out of both sides of their mouth on this, and they're not admitting publicly that this is really all about marketing and ratings and prestige and the company you keep. And that bothers me. But you know what? They're entitled. I think that the kids are the victims, but in the end, so is their reputation, the reputation of the university. So be it.
Do you have a sense on if you feel the dam's just breaking and it's, more and more and more and more? Do you think that, really when you still look at it, it's still a small number of them that have gone back in the big scheme of things, and it's
absolutely
moved to being pretty stasis right now? I mean, where do you Do you have any sense on where that's going?
I think we're going to, well, and what do I know really,
Sure.
except my intuition is I didn't hear any talk at the conference that there was another wave of colleges that are likely to jump back to requiring scores. I think the backlash against the schools that went back quickly before having any credible research, where they had no argument except the faculty made us do this.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that's what a couple of the schools have said is, oh, it's very anecdotal, but the faculty, the faculty all had high SAT scores, so they'd rather know that their classrooms are, so what? The faculty want homogeneity and less diversity. They want to be less of an access and equity focused university. Come on. No, I'm hoping that the wave this last year, I don't know what's going to happen at the state level, whether there are going to be some states like Georgia, North Carolina, Florida. I don't think there are other state scholarship organizations that are as tied to the standardized tests as those states.
Well, Florida and Tennessee are for sure.
Yeah, no, and
Georgia,
I think,
Georgia's
but I don't think there are more.
Yeah.
I asked around, but
Yeah. Did you pick up, I just picked up such a theme of, and I did a whole episode on this, that college enrollment is under attack for all of the reasons. I won't mention them all here, but schools are concerned with, on different levels, depending on sort of where they are in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
From just pure survival to, will we have to cut programs?
Oh, yeah.
Like, that feels so real. And I think so many of the things that I heard at the conference flow out of that. One thing, for example, which I haven't talked about much on the podcast, is we've talked about it, periodically, but the growth of these percent plans in the different states.
Yes.
South Carolina has that now. Tennessee has that now.
Michigan.
Wisconsin has that now. Texas just went from 6% to 5%. I went to a session with the South Carolina rep who mentioned how helpful that was, because it's kind of a form of it's not direct admission the way we describe it, right? Go on a portal and let them pick you, but it is from a standpoint of, you've removed any potential barrier of somebody being rejected. And the VP of enrollment in South Carolina talked about how powerful that messaging has been into rural communities.
Yes.
So that they won't get rejected, and especially for states that either are experiencing outmigration or they just would like to see more of their own residents access their flagship school or whatever. But there's a lot of things like that. You could argue direct admission. They're all attempts to counteract the fact that schools are finding it harder to find either students or to make the numbers work, students that can pay so that the budget can work.
Right.
That, to me, that theme was just everywhere. I don't know if you picked it up the way I did. And it's obviously not new, but boy, it sure feels like a lot of things are coming together, almost like a tornado all at once.
Well, what worries me is that, we've kind of established an elite class of universities that are not tuition dependent. They can basically do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Mostly, this is more the private sector, perhaps, where they're not accountable to their state legislatures. And that worries me. We've always had some of that, and a lot of those institutions have become much more equity and access focused. But I'm so disheartened by the return by those institutions to standardized testing, because they are the very ones who can do without it.
Well, what concerns me is how much of the media space they occupy.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore, they just have an outsized role in the perception, and Jay Rosner brought that point up really well.
Yes.
Because the perception people have right now is almost like the era of test optional is over, everybody's going back. And that's just not
Oh, it's
true.
not true at all.
But you would never know that reading the articles that Forbes and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal put out on college admissions. which really gives it an outsized role. And you also see that, you and I see this in the counseling room when we have kids who literally think they may not get in any colleges, which if you really understood the big scheme of things, that's kind of really ridiculous, right? When
That's right.
the average acceptance rate is 73% now, up from 63%. So 3 in 4 kids getting in average school, but that's just so not the perception. And that concerns me, that continues to concern me because I see how it trickles into, and then just this continually fighting this perception that there's this short list of schools that are the good ones. Boy, it's a tough time to be in admissions and to get people to pay
Yes.
if you're
Yeah.
not one of those schools, and especially if you're smaller and you're a little bit out in the hinterlands. Like, that's a really tough job.
And that's where merit aid is, so critical. And a lot of the colleges that we're seeing that are in bad condition right now and possibly headed for retrenchment on all sorts of levels are the ones that I think, their discount rate has just gone up and up and up. And in
Yeah,
order
more
to
than
enroll a class, they have to
60%.
keep raising the tuition, but then they just keep funding, more kids through, discounting and merit aid. And I don't know. It used to be
Yeah, because that's the only way they feel they can get people to
that's
come.
the only way to get a class.
Yeah, the only
That's
way is,
right.
you talked about it before, bribery, colleges buying kids. But then at some point, you're really reducing the quality of your institution. I had a conversation with a school, and I'm not going to name them, but they said to me, and it's a pretty reputable school, but they said to me on my trip, and they said, what we're doing is not sustainable long term.
Yeah.
It's just not. And something's going to have to change,
Wow.
And this is not a school that's going to close, but I mean, how many schools are slashing programs, and slashing, I mean, like really reputable schools.
Oh yeah.
So that's
Absolutely.
a
Well, and
concern.
the day is over where a family that used to say to me, "We're applying to these private colleges, and if we don't get into one of these, then we're going to go with our state flagship." Because there was almost that sense of guarantee at their state flagship that, if I don't get into an Ivy, I'll go to, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, or I'll go to UCLA or UVA. And now that is no longer the strategy. It may be for a lot of families, but not for many, many families. They can't rely on their own, state flagships, which is why the rank guaranteed admission based on rank, I think has been coming on strong.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I mean, I'm an advocate of it overall. I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
not perfect, but I think that it's an access tool. It's especially impactful in like rural communities and communities where people
Yes.
don't have good counseling and wondered, either one, do they really want me? Two, would I ever get in? And also, would I ever be able to afford that school? And then some of the schools are combining them with some financial incentives too. So when finances is the concern, that's what the VP of South Carolina said. He said, we took a look at a population, top 10% making under 80,000.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, we were already giving those families so much. But when we turned around and said no tuition, no fees, he said, we got over 1,000 more applications in 1 year.
Wow.
Just because it felt like, and he said it really didn't cost us that much because we're already kind of doing that for that group on the back end. So like removing those barriers. And I think we're gonna inevitably have to see more creativity. And you and I have talked about this in the past, right? Because this isn't our first enrollment cliff, right? Was it late 90s or late 80s, early 90s? And schools got creative and they used a lot of creativity to make it through that.
That's right.
And I think you're going to see some more of these things. Direct admission is one, top 10% or top 5% plans is another. And you can't blame colleges either, too. You look at a place like Wisconsin, and regionals come in and they recruit away your top kids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot of research that shows, I've seen it with my own kids, like where you go to college is where you live. This was the whole idea behind the Hope Scholarship back in 1994 in Georgia. Like, why are we losing our top talent? Not only do they leave the state, but they probably won't come back.
They don't come back.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's keep our best talent here, and that that helps the economy long range. So anyway, great conversation as always. Thank you, Susan.
Oh, you're welcome, Mark. Always interesting.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of 4 of my interview with David Hawkins, David introduced the next most important factor that colleges rate it as considerably important and moderately important after the big 4 we discussed last week. We have a robust conversation about the factor that came in at number 6 in the State of College Admissions Survey. David introduces some more factors and where they come in, and David and I have a robust conversation about why class rank has dropped so much from some of the past studies they've done in previous years. David shares where standardized testing comes in, and we also talk about why testing ranked so much higher in the past and why it has fallen so far in the recent State of College Admissions report. And David walks us through the final factors that showed up as important but not decisive in the State of College Admissions, factors involved in admissions decisions. Listen and enjoy. Yeah, so let's keep moving down the list.
Yeah. So the next, what I call again tip factors in this category, I'm gonna take actually 3 of them together because they're very traditional in the sense that people are familiar with them. One is the essay or writing sample. 19% of colleges said that was of considerable importance, which might surprise some people. Only 19%. But 37% said that it was of moderate importance. So there you're getting back up towards the 50% mark. But even then, I think maybe folks might be surprised that the essay doesn't carry as much weight as it might seem to in the popular consciousness.
Yeah, and I wanna really come back to that because after you walk us through the list, I'd love for us to talk about the high school survey you do.
Right.
Because that's really fascinating. There you can see the gap in perception between what people think matters and what really matters. And as somebody who's been doing this for a while, when I look at your, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when I look at your high school survey, yeah, that's consistent with what I see people thinking matters the most. And I think this is such a great way of showing people, okay, this is what you think matters, and this is what really matters. And that can have a lot of ramifications for people to just come to that realization.
Absolutely. And I can't resist throwing in a quote from a former president of NACAC, Jim Jump from here in Virginia. He said, I wish, this is about the application overall, but it can be applied to the essay particularly. He said, I wish college admission officers spent as much time reviewing applications as students put in actually doing them.
Sure.
And I would add counselors too. Because the counselors spend a lot of time on these, advising students on these areas. The other 2 that are close to this one are counselor recommendation and teacher recommendation. Not surprising that around 11-12% of colleges have those as considerably important. Another 40% on each of those 2 say that they're moderately important. So clearly here you again have half of colleges saying that there is some weight to these recommendation letters. So those are ones that people are familiar with. Right after essay and before the recommendations, though, there's something called students' interest in attending. We in the business call that demonstrated interest, right?
Sure.
Basically, and I don't know how many families are familiar with this. We, in our ethical best practices, we suggest that colleges be forthright about whether they consider this. But basically, in crude terms, the colleges are just looking to figure out, is this student really interested in coming here? Or is this just sort of an application that they dashed off because they wanted to apply or see how many they could get into? So this interest in attending, 16% of colleges said this was considerably important, and another 28% said that it was moderately important. And that's something we added probably back around 2010 because our counselors were asking us. They said, look, we think this is actually going on more than people know. And basically it is a thing. Colleges are trying to figure out, is this student really committed to attending our institution? And I guess to get into a little bit of jargon, the reason that it matters to some colleges is that they try to do this balance of keeping their acceptance rates and what are called their yield rates,
Yeah.
which is the percentage of admitted students who actually end up attending. They try to keep those numbers fairly consistent for many reasons, and we can go into that later if you
Sure.
want. But the bottom line is, for a fair number of institutions, according to this, around somewhere in the low to mid 40%, feel like they really want to know, are you really interested in us, or is this just an application that got dashed off because either your parents wanted you to, or all your friends are doing it, or some other reason?
No, I think this is important. It's something we talk about on the podcast quite a bit. I would like you to go into it. What would you have said if you wanted to add more to that, David?
Yeah, for better, for worse, and I'm not passing any
Mhm.
judgment here, but institutions do like to see consistency in their numbers. And for the very selective institutions, it's about maintaining those insanely low acceptance rates. And for institutions that are not as selective, it can have a lot to do with, well, we really need to focus our scarce recruitment dollars and our scarce cultivation dollars on those students who really seem like they're going to attend our institution. It's important for those and other reasons to institutions that they understand how many students they have to accept in order to get the number of students in their incoming class that they need, often for budget purposes for those institutions that aren't rolling in money, and that's a lot of the institutions, frankly. So what happens is they take a look at their applicant pool and they say, well, this student looks like they're not fully interested for a variety of reasons. It could be that the essay was not terribly detailed, or perhaps it was that they that it seems like they just dashed off answers, or perhaps they never heard from the student before receiving the application. It could be a whole variety of things. On the other side of that, they see an applicant that has visited the campus, perhaps, or if they can't visit, that they've gone to a college fair, that they went to a meeting at their school with the recruiter. And what they do is they look at all that. They look at all of the data that exists outside of the student's application to say, is this student really interested in us? And if they are, that could be sort of a mark in their favor when it comes time to make decisions.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot that actually makes sense around that. I get why big public schools don't do it, but for example, when we had Cal Lutheran on our podcast, Matt Ward, VP of Enrollment, he said, listen, we have a 5 times higher yield if somebody visits.
Yeah.
And that's just like, how could you not factor that in? I was having a conversation with some of the folks from Rhodes a while ago, and they said when we have a stealth applicant, and they actually said this at a SACAC conference, so this is public knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
A stealth applicant, someone literally, there's no knowledge where this person came from ever, right? Never filled out anything online. They just, for all we know, dropped out of Mars, and there was 0 engagement. There's a stealth applicant that we know literally has less than a 1% chance of coming. So how can you blame a school for not sort of factoring that in, especially when the public does judge schools by acceptance rates? I would argue the public judges schools more by acceptance rates than rankings.
Yes.
I mean, there are so many amazing schools I know with 80 and 90% admit rates that I can't get anybody to look at them. And it's like, if that school had a 38% admit rate, people would look at them. And I have families tell me all the time, oh no, we're only looking at schools under X% admit rate. And they miss out on amazing diamonds in the rough. So colleges are very much mindful of that, right? So why blow your admit rate up for someone that has a very low chance of coming? And then you have the other point, which you haven't even talked about, which you got to get the right number of heads and beds. There's only so much money. Do you want to go out with unlimited money for people that almost have no chance of coming when you're trying to manage that piece and not go over budget? So I totally understand this. Of course, it's controversial because it feels like playing God, and you can misread the tea leaves and somebody legitimately gets missed out on that generally had interest. But sort of from my own admissions background and just experiencing this work, I totally understand why schools do it, and I actually don't fault them for it.
Yeah.
And then also nowadays with students applying to more and more and more schools, I mean, you guys have the data on this, right? It was at the NACAC conference. Yield has gone down from 36.3 to 30.3 in the last decade.
Yep.
That's a big difference.
It
If
is.
you have 10,000 acceptances and you 36% versus 30%, like, you know, it keeps some of the enrollment management firms in business doing their affinity prediction scores that they do out there.
That's right. Well, and Mark, excuse me. One of the things that's kind of unique about NACAC is that we don't necessarily represent a professional or a type of school or institution. We actually are committed to a set of standards at NACAC, and so when you mix all of that up in a bowl, you know, institutions highly selective, budget, sort of revenue, tuition dependent, you get this undeniable interest in whether a student is going to attend or not, and
Sure.
that does carry weight in the admissions process. So from our perspective, the difference sort of that we make here is that not only do we report out on how many colleges typically consider that, our standards, our best practices suggest that colleges just be transparent about it.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. The small liberal arts institution that had about a 35 to 40% acceptance rate,
Mhm.
where my son actually ended up going, when we went to the first college session that at the university where he attended, they were right up front. They said, "Here's 2 words that we want you to know: demonstrated interest." And
Mhm.
they explained it. And
Yeah.
it sounds a little crass sometimes, but it basically they said, "Look, we don't we want to focus on those students who really want to be here."
I feel the same way. When I
Yeah,
have schools, the Lehighs, the Americans, Rhodes, a bunch of them that say it up front, I commend them for their transparency. My concern is there's a lot that are not transparent, and
correct.
I get why they don't want to give away the secret sauce, because it would hurt their ability to sort of do some predictions. Like people feel like they feel like people would game the system. So I get if they don't want to give away, oh, we've noticed that if people go to this section of the website and spend a lot of time here, that correlates with. I get that, but I wish they would be more transparent. And I know obviously that's in common data set too. And I always appreciate it when someone says, very important,
Yeah,
because sometimes I see what people say there, and then I actually see what they do. And I still feel like there's a disconnect that people, like, how many times have people stood up and said, we don't look at demonstrated interest? I would argue if you have 2 rounds of early decision,
you do.
of course you do. I'm
Yeah,
going to shout out Jim Bach of Swarthmore College, who I'm about to interview coming up here. He said, of course we look at demonstrated interest. We have early decision. What do you think that is?
right.
Right?
That is the sort of the essence of demonstrated interest. Is
But how many times you hear highly selective schools say we don't look at demonstrated interest, and they have
right,
2 rounds of early decision and differential admit rates, right? That's like
right.
almost the norm, that rather than the exception.
It is the purified form of demonstrated interest, if you will.
Sure. So
But
let's keep
yeah.
going down your list. This is great.
Yeah. So then after those initial tip factors, you do see a bit of a drop off. You see extracurricular activities. 7% of schools said that was considerably important, whereas 44% said moderately important. High school class rank, kind of what I call a tertiary measure based on those very first measures,
Sure.
but it's a sort of comparison of you versus the other high school students. But that is 5% or 6% said that's considerably important, and only 22% said moderately. And I should add, high school class rank has dropped like a rock over the last 15 years. It used to be up there with the essay or writing sample, but enough people have figured out that, hey, that's not actually first of all, it's not a direct measure of how a student has done in high school, because you could finish 50th in a class, but have a 4.0 at some of these schools. So it has dropped precipitously. And I think the only schools that really use those anymore are state public institutions that exist in states that have those percentage plans. So like Texas and California
Sure.
and Washington.
I have a slightly different take on that.
Uh-huh.
I've seen the statistics of the percentage of people reporting rank.
That
And
too.
it's
Yeah.
down to like 27% in one place that I saw. And that's about what I see anecdotally, about
Right.
1 in 4 transcripts. So I feel like it's diminished only because most colleges aren't getting access to it as a factor where, as I interact with different admissions, they actually really appreciate rank because it can be one way of sussing out grade inflation. I've mentioned this on the podcast a few times, but school I'm working with now, 84% of kids have A minuses or or higher because that's in the school profile.
Right.
Well, that can be really helpful, right? To look at a 3.8 GPA means something totally different if a 3.8 puts you in the top 20% or the bottom 20% of the class.
Right.
But I think what's happened is it's not in high school's best interest oftentimes, especially if you're in a school that's a competitive suburb or an independent school. It's not in your best interest to list rank because a kid might be 40th percentile and highly selective schools might just pass on you immediately. Whereas maybe if you can hide that, some of them will still take a shot at you. So they realize it's not. And then also it introduces that competitive culture that
That's
people
right.
don't like, where kids are pitted against each other and people are not sleeping and saying, can I skip lunch and take another AP because I'm trying to climb the rank? So I think for both of those reasons, more and more and more schools don't have rank, and they're therefore, you're not going to place a lot of value on something that you're not getting most of the time.
That is absolutely true, and we've seen that in our high school survey over the years. The other
Hmm.
thing I'll just add, the competition there has gotten so crazy at times that people have actually initiated lawsuits against schools to somehow claim or adjust the rank of their student in the school. So it really is a lot of K-12 schools are also, I think, as you said, seeing it as a sort of unhealthy area of focus versus just focusing on what the student learns. So I think that's where that sort of came in. And now we get to the one where it's sort of like the drum roll has started. But admission test results now come in behind all of those other factors we've already talked about. This is post-pandemic, of course. 5% of colleges said test scores are considerably important. 25 say moderately important, and then 39 say limited importance. So I think what you see there, we had seen actually a decline in these numbers on testing over the last decade. So it was clear that colleges were already starting to de-emphasize to some degree, or at least an increasing number of colleges were starting to de-emphasize tests. But now, given the pandemic, the move to test optional, it's now down here near the bottom of the table. And I expect that we may see an uptick in coming years because we've seen some colleges return to these test requirements. But I do want to underscore the fact tests were actually declining for about 10 years prior to the pandemic. So I think that the pandemic was just a disruption that really skewed the scale. And I don't think we're likely to see tests return to the spot that they were even pre-pandemic, but
No,
much
because
less
you
10
had
or
them
20
as
years
high
ago.
as 3 or 4 in some of your past. They were
Exactly.
consistently up that 3-4 spot for years in
That's
your
right.
study. Now, I do think some of it is the same thing I said with rank too, right? Like
Yeah,
more than half the population didn't submit test scores for the last few years. So when you're not getting it as much, then it's going to be devalued in your process.
that's right.
But there's no question that colleges discovered, hey, many of them discovered that, hey, we can make, we have enough tools in the toolkit to make decisions without scores. And even the number, and I attended a good NACAC session on this, like the number of schools that have gone back to testing, it's not as loud as the media voice makes it sound,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, lunatic fringe is what I
Yeah.
always. And of course, that's what sells papers and stories
Sure.
and things like that. And I get it, but it is not representative of the whole country. So then I'll just run through the last ones fairly
Sure.
quickly. Portfolio, 5% of schools say it's considerably important. 11% say moderate. That's gonna be your
Sure.
specialty schools, art, dance, even some undergraduate programs like business are now looking at the portfolio model. So that'll be interesting to watch. But below that is the interview. If here it's only 4% of colleges say it's considerably important, 9% say moderately important. My sense is that only the most selective schools require interviews.
Hmm.
The 32% that say that they're limited, I think, offer them if you want, but you don't have to. So clearly, interview is down there.
And then for many schools, they're non-evaluative too. Some of them they're
Exactly.
evaluative, and some of them they're more about just being high touch and keeping your alumni involved, and diminishing the work for your staff, and
Right.
and it's in many cases, some of the schools are doing interviews in the middle of the junior year, and they're using them more as an incentive to move you along the admission funnel and try
Right.
to get you to apply. Now that's not the most selective. The most selective usually make sure like the Georgetowns and the MITs still places that value interviews and they wait till you've applied. But yeah, it is. That's a very small sector of the population that even has the manpower to factor that in, and you tend to be dealing with the most selective group there.
Yeah, exactly. And then below interview is work, with only 2.2% saying considerable. But here's an important distinction: 31% say moderately important. And I think really you alluded to this earlier, Mark. I think a lot of these factors they're overlapping.
Yep.
So extracurricular activities and work
Yeah.
are similar for a lot of
Total
people.
overlap. I mean, you put work in the extracurricular space on the Common App.
Exactly. So, a distinction that existed, I think, even before I took the survey on, and something we could consider changing. But just to break it out, it is clear that colleges do value work experience as as something similar to extracurricular activities through the school setting. The last two are state graduation exam scores and subject test scores, like an AP or IB subject test. Those only less than 2% of colleges consider those considerably important. And here's an interesting difference here. 7% say that the state exam scores are of moderate importance. 22% of schools say that the subject test scores are moderately important. So I think you see a distinction between those two at the very end there. There was a time about, I think, 10, 12 years ago where it looked like we were going to start getting a pretty wide range of state graduation exams that were actually calibrated more towards college readiness than they were to basic mastery. And so we put that in there thinking, well, this could sort of play off or play against the standardized test scores, because state college readiness measures would be much more calibrated to the curriculum in those states than a generic sort of admission test would be. But with the for those of you who were around, the Common Core of data, or the Common Core, sorry, not of data, but the Common Core curriculum that was floated around this same time, ultimately succumbed to political pressure. And again, not passing judgment, just that it ended up not being very popular. And so those state exams kind of went down with it in some ways. So, however, the subject test scores, this one, even though it's at the bottom of the chart, the way we've arranged it, if you could arrange these differently and they'd come in different spots, the fact that 22% of schools consider this of moderate importance, I think it almost links all the way back up to the top of the chart, where we talk about high school grades in college prep courses. If you have taken AP exams like sophomore, junior year,
Mm-hmm.
or first semester, senior year, I don't know how many do that, but in any event, you've got, if you submit those with your application, that becomes another data point.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, NACAC had a commission in 2008 that considered the role of standardized tests in admission. And the chair of that commission, who is the dean of admissions at Harvard, said in their research, the subject test scores on AP exams were more predictive of success than the SAT or ACT were. So at the highly selective and at other selective institutions, submitting these scores does seem to sort of, particularly if you score well, does seem to present an opportunity for the student, and it does seem to be considered by the college. So important.
Well,
sort of
one
note
thing
to
that's
land
not in your list that I would be interested in is something that a lot of schools look at, I just call it fit to major, right? And
on. Yeah.
fit to major can be really important. And for schools looking at fit to major, there can be a real interest in that. Like, let's see all aspects of how you, just to keep it simple, you tell me you want to be engineering. Okay, let's see your math rigor, let's see your math grades, let's see your math course selection. Let's see what your math teacher has to say. And is there some testing over here? SAT, ACT, or the subject stuff. And what does that look like as far as how strong of a math student you are? Because that's going to correlate. And now let's look at your physics grade and your physics rigor. And so there may be a little bit of that going on too, because obviously the essay, what we used to call the SAT 2s or SAT subject tests, they're obsolete. So, back when you were asking about subject test scores at one point, some of the more selective schools were requiring 2 or 3 subject tests. But now those 1-hour subject tests have been obsolete now for 3 years.
Yeah, that's Mark, that's an excellent example, in fact, of the way in which our extremely skilled and expert membership has contributed to this research, among so many other things.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we could do almost a whole panel similar to the one I just went through on fit.
Mm-hmm.
What are the ways in which you ascertain fit? Major, athletics. I don't know. You could probably come up with a whole thing. So I'd love to
Yes,
love
the
to be able to
essays
talk
are.
to you more.
Yeah. The essays are a huge component of that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's why those questions, especially, I mean, all of the essays, but especially the college specific custom prompts, right? Because the
Yeah.
school's literally sitting back and saying, what do we not have as much of as that we'd like to have? And then how can we ask a question to suss out people that have those personal qualities and interests that we're looking for, and then fit. A great story on this. I was talking to an admission officer who was telling me that they were on the fence about whether to admit a student, and the school has an racist initiative, and because they're able to go in and see the electronic footprint, they saw the students spent a lot of time on that portion of the website. And when it came to it, that's what carried the day. They felt like, look, this person seems mission aligned. Look at how much time they're spending on these sections of, and then of course there were other things in the application that were consonant and consistent with that. But yeah, happy to talk to you offline about any of the stuff. I'm kind of an admissions junkie, so this stuff is fun for me. So we'd be happy to talk to you more about anything you want, Dave.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say, to your point there, it's not in this year's survey, but back as I realized that in my career here at NACAC, the internet has sort of fully matured,
Sure.
or at least to the point where it is now. And there was a time where we were actually doing research to figure out how much colleges could figure out about the applicants, right? And so the thing you just mentioned, time spent on a website,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of students and families have no idea that anytime you click a button, anytime you visit a page, fill out a form, whatever, that goes into a dashboard that the admissions offices have. So I think that, one of the ways in which I've appreciated that this research has drawn this kind of information out for students and families is that when a college considers perhaps your demonstrated interest in attending, you just know that, hey, it's even sort of an incentive. Now, you mentioned obviously gaming the system. Don't want folks to do that, but the idea that you actually can go to the admissions website and you can reach out, and it is beneficial to you in more ways than one. It gives you the information you need, and it shows the admissions office that you're really interested in pursuing an education there.
Friends, this concludes this segment of my interview with David Hawkins. We hope you join us next week for the next segment. Friends, on Monday's episode, our In the News articles are back. Julie and I will discuss an article from Inside Higher Ed by Josh Moody entitled, USC Prioritized Wealthy Students as Walk-On Athletes. For a question from a listener, Hillary Dickman from Colorado College is back 2 weeks in a row. And we're answering a question from a mom from New York. And she wants to know, do you have any tips for my student when colleges visit her high school to do information sessions and talk with students? I thought Hillary would be great for that because she's out doing those visits this fall. Final part of Jay Rosner's interview. But we move away from tips from the SAT and the ACT and just discuss a range of issues, including no harm testing policies schools are adopting. And Jay gives us an insider's view on how the University of California adopted their position on test-free college admissions. Finally, we close with the final part of Linda and Lisa discussing Linda's recent visit to Colorado State University. Friends, I was helping a student from Ohio yesterday with their Wake Forest essay. And one of the essays that Wake Forest has talks about how Maya Angelou, was once a faculty member at Wake. And so you have to pick your favorite Maya Angelou quote and then explain why it's important to you. So I thought I'd close out today with my favorite Maya Angelou quote because it's something I can apply to every counseling session I have and almost every encounter I have with anyone. And I would challenge you because I believe that's true for you as well. And it simply says this: I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. Maya Angelou. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.